Welcome everyone to tonight's virtual lecture, not at the amerikahaus, but with the amerikahaus. Thanks for finding the time to join us. My name is Markus Faltermeyer, and I have the honor of organizing this event tonight for us. In the recent months, in fact, in the recent years since 2016, we were oftentimes confronted by political decisions of the Trump administration that seemed, at least at first sight, disruptive. That is, breaking a pattern of what has been in place before. The administration challenged the free trade orthodoxy, for example, that seemed to rule other recent administrations. It questions institutions such as the WTO, it put pressure on the transatlantic partnership, and it also seemed to revolutionize long-standing traditions within the Republican Party itself. However, as we have learned in other contexts and in other discussions that we did at the amerikahaus, these developments are not always as disruptive as they seem. Instead, they have a longer historical trajectory. Think of the transatlantic relations. The erosion of the partnership between the US and Germany began at least as early as 2003, or you can at least make that argument, when Chancellor Schröder refused to join the coalition of the willing in its overthrow of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Today, we will talk about multilateral institutions, and the question that we are asking is, whether the recent Republican approach towards, for example, the WTO, towards NATO, towards the UN, etc., is new. I'm very proud that we have Benjamin Fordham, Professor Fordham, from the SUNY Binghamton with us today to help us answer these questions. I met Ben about 10 years ago. We were both fellows at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. I was still a small, tiny scholar. I was writing my dissertation back then, but Ben was already a highly renowned expert in the field of political science. His work focuses on the influence of domestic political and economic considerations on foreign policy choices, especially on trade policy, military spending, the use of force, and alliance formation. He's currently doing research at the Princeton University, or I think right now is actually in Binghamton due to COVID-19, but he was supposed to be at Princeton University, and is working on the trajectory of the recent denigration of multilateral policies and institutions within the Republican Party. So thank you, Ben, for being with us tonight. We are very proud to have you here tonight. The floor is yours. We are excited to hear you talk. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Marcus. Thanks for inviting me to present some of my research. It's always exciting to present work to a new audience of people I haven't talked to before. So the work I want to talk about today is co-authored with Mike Flynn, a former student of mine who's at Kansas State University now, and it's part of a book project. And what I want to do is present you one aspect of this that I think is especially important and topical. So let me share my screen so I can show you a few slides. Might help the talk. All right. Okay, there we go. So there's the title of my talk and my co-author, Mike Flynn. Let me just start by belaboring the obvious a little bit. The last two Republican presidents have been pretty obviously hostile to multilateral rules. So the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, from the UN Human Rights Council, from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They've threatened even to withdraw the United States from the World Trade Organization, though they haven't gone quite that far yet. The Bush administration actually wasn't that different in this respect. They withdrew the United States from the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, and they ended US participation in the International Criminal Court, among other things. So the reason for hostility to multilateral rules like this among Republicans is because they prevent the United States from fully exploiting its sort of position of power in the international system. You may recognize this guy if you paid any attention to US politics recently. Was Trump's national security advisor until the middle of last year. And he's since written a book that's highly critical of the Trump administration. But he explained his own opposition to multilateral rules this way back in 2005. It's a big mistake for us to grant any validity to international law, even when it may seem in our short-term interest to do so, because over the long term, the goals of those who think that international law really means anything are those who want to constrict the United States. So again, it's because of the constraint that it poses on the US. Now, I should say that this view departs pretty sharply from the view of most American policymakers in the post-war period and from most American scholars who study this stuff. The conventional view, the dominant one, is that the US has in fact played a predominant role, a disproportionate role really, in writing the rules that govern these international organizations. It's better to get other states to adhere to this rule, even if in the short run, perhaps you lose a case before the WTO, a dispute resolution mechanism or something like that. In the long run, the rules promote the interests of the United States. Moreover, US opposition to these rules and efforts to undermine them threaten the existence of the rules themselves, which explains a lot of the really fearful response you get to this from American policymakers and from others around the world. So in the remainder of my time here, I want to do three things. First, I want to show you that conservative Republicans have opposed multilateral rules for more than a century. There's a deeper history to this. Sometimes it can seem new, but it's not new as a position among conservative Republicans. Secondly, I want to show you that this position originated during the 1890 to 1914 period, more than a century ago. It can be strange to think of something still persisting after such a long period of history, but I think the fact that there haven't been major interruptions in the US party system or in American institutions allows these things to be transmitted through time in ways that wouldn't be true in every state. And lastly, I want to explain why this position has persisted over time. This is something that really does require explanation because opposition to multilateralism rests really uneasily with the US position around the world. In a way, it's a kind of anachronistic position, and I want to try to explain why that's the case. So let me start by trying to answer this question. Have conservative Republicans consistently held this position? Now, rather than just sort of assert this or accept it as conventional wisdom, my co-author and I decided to gather some data to see if it was really true. And let me tell you about two sources of data we used to try to answer this question. The first concern Senate debates over the jurisdiction of international courts. Courts really get at the constraining feature of multilateral rules because it's their job to hold states to the rules that they've agreed to obey. There were three courts that have been debated in the US Senate over time. I have them listed on the slide here: the Permanent Court of International Justice, associated with the League of Nations, the International Court of Justice associated with the UN, and the International Criminal Court, which is really a more recent development. All these courts are different, but the issue before the Senate in each case was whether the US should accept their jurisdiction. And there are between 1 and 17 roll call votes in each of these debates over time that allow you to get at the position that senators took. And the second set of data I want to look at here is co-sponsorship of anti-UN bills in the House and the Senate. These are bills to do things like withdraw the US from the United Nations, which a measure that comes up surprisingly often, to cut US financial support to the UN, or to limit its authority in other ways. Co-sponsorship of legislation has been possible in the Congress since 1973. Before that time, only individual members could introduce bills, but after that, they could do it as groups. Members can propose legislation on just about anything they like, and there's very little effort by party leaders in the United States to limit this activity. And that's mainly because once these bills are proposed, they're referred to committees, and once they get to the committee, then the leadership can decide to let bills they don't like die and bring others up that they do like instead. We found a total of 292 anti-UN bills proposed between 1973 and 2018, and 3,402 individual sponsorship decisions. So I'm going to turn first to these votes on the jurisdiction of international courts. We use a statistical model to estimate the probability that various types of senators would vote in opposition to the jurisdiction of international courts during each of these debates. To summarize the results, I'll show you a graph. The bars on the graph indicate the probability that a particular type of member would vote against the jurisdiction of these courts during the debates that are indicated on the horizontal axis of the graph. So we look at conservative Republicans, mean Republicans, that's the average, the ideologically average Republican within the Republican delegation, the average Democrat, and a liberal Democrat. And what you can see here is that Republicans, especially conservatives, have always been more likely to oppose these courts' jurisdiction. During the middle of the 20th century, there were some big inter-party splits over this. Some Republicans were in favor, others were against it. Conservatives were consistently against it. But these differences disappear in the 1990s. After the Cold War ends, the party differences become quite a bit more stark, something I'll return to in a minute. So the second set of data I'd mentioned were these co-sponsorships of UN bills. And we did a similar thing. We estimated a statistical model to see across the entire 1973 to 2018 period, what was the probability that particular kinds of members would sponsor at least one of these bills in a given 2-year Congress. And this was what we found. It turns out that conservative Republicans are much more likely to sponsor these anti-UN bills than other types of members of Congress. The average Republican, a bit less likely. Again, there's a bit of a party split that lasts up until the 1990s among Republicans. And Democrats are just unlikely to do this. It's also worth noting that sponsoring an anti-UN bill is not a rare thing for a conservative Republican to do. In fact, in any given 2-year Congress, about half of the conservative Republicans sponsor at least one of these things, and some of them sponsor a lot more of them. One thing that's also worth noting here is that this pattern really strengthens after the Cold War ends. So I have a graph here that shows you the number of these anti-UN bills that are introduced, the total number of sponsorships, and the total number of members sponsoring at least one bill. The Cold War comes to an end in either the 101st or the 102nd Congress. The Berlin Wall comes down during the 101st Congress. The Soviet Union disintegrates during the 102nd Congress. And you can see that after that, there are many more of these things that are happening. This upsurge in anti-UN bills occurs for 2 reasons. One is that conservative Republicans become much more likely to sponsor these things after the Cold War ends. In fact, the probability that a conservative Republican member of Congress will sponsor one of these bills roughly doubles after 1990. At the same time, the Republican Party also becomes much more monolithically conservative. So in addition to these members being more likely to do it, there are also more of these members out there. And this gives you this pattern where things increase over time. So where did this position come from? Well, I'm going to argue that it has its origins in the American foreign policy of the 1890 to 1914 period. You have to travel back in time with me here to understand what this looks like. One thing that's important to remember, and the first point on my slide here, is that this was a period of Republican political predominance. Really from the end of the Civil War, and especially from the 1890s on until the 1930s, the New Deal era, Republican Party was the dominant party in the United States. They won most of the presidential elections, and they usually controlled Congress. This was particularly true from 1897 to 1913, when they continuously controlled both houses of Congress and the White House for that entire period of nearly 20 years, actually more than 20 years. And that's when this foreign policy emerged. So it's a policy that's strongly associated with the Republican Party. What did the policy look like? Well, it was incompatible with multilateralism on a number of points. First off, it was highly protectionist when it came to trade. Industries in the northeastern United States demanded high levels of protection against manufactured imports from overseas. And they received this from the Republican Party. In fact, political scientists will tell you that this was really the central commitment of the Republican Party, their most important policy, one on which there was near unanimous support within the party, and one that they were quite inflexible on. And this was also a commitment they maintained up until after World War II. The Republican Party was the protectionist party. Weirdly, they're only returning to it now after a period of being more in favor of free trade. A second point, this policy entailed the pursuit of advantageous bilateral deals and unilateral privileges in less developed areas of the world. There was a broad consensus in the United States that overseas markets were vitally important for the future of the US economy. Republican policymakers became very pessimistic about the future of US access to wealthier European markets because of the high tariffs that the US kept in place. This led to retaliation by most of the European states, and it led American policymakers to conclude that the future of US trade really lay in less developed parts of the world, especially in Latin America and East Asia, areas where they hope to have kind of exclusive US access. You know, US foreign policy in this way was not in the least bit exceptional. It actually looks quite a bit like the foreign policies that were pursued by other imperial powers during this period. The US was a little more reticent than some about acquiring large land areas as colonies, as formal colonies anyway. They much preferred islands and things like that. But the basic thrust of the policy was quite similar to what other states were up to. The third point is that the US adopted a very competitive and even hostile posture toward other industrialized states. The US tariff system and the US plans to carve out a sort of imperial control in Latin America and perhaps parts of East Asia, were things that were going to actually inflict material harm on these states. There was no reason to expect other states to want to cooperate in this endeavor, and the United States didn't. Instead, they constructed a great deal of power projection capability to sort of deter interference in US imperial plans from other states. Got kind of a famous picture here of the US Atlantic Fleet departing Hampton Roads in 1907 for a voyage around the world. They were sent out there by Theodore Roosevelt, who was very proud of the fleet. By the end of the Roosevelt administration, while the US spent relatively little on its military compared to a lot of other states, it actually had the second largest Navy in the world. It's just a tiny, tiny sort of land force and a large Navy. The reason for this was that the US expected to have to use this force to deter European intervention in the Americas, where they wanted exclusive control and things like that. The bottom line here is that multilateral rules are incompatible with the kind of claims of privilege and the expectations about lack of cooperation that American policymakers held during this earlier period. This position became party dogma after the debate over US entry into the League of Nations in 1919 and 1920, when Republicans were effectively able to stop the Wilson administration from entering the United States into the League of Nations. The reservations that Republicans expressed to the League all grew out of these pre-1914 policy commitments that they made. They were really about the things I've just discussed. And opposition to entry into the League of Nations remained part of the Republican Party platform until World War II. So this was not a commitment that they took lightly, and it was something that they kept reiterating. Well, okay, so this position originated in the early 20th century. We're still left with this puzzle. How is this position transmitted through time? Why did it last? And I'm going to offer you an explanation that has two parts. The first part has to do with the cost of changing an ideological position. Now, this cost is political and social. It's not really an intellectual cost. It doesn't arise from the logic that holds these positions together, at least not the intellectual logic. It arises from the political logic, from the demands of holding the coalition together. We know this in part because self-conscious conservative Republicans, people who thought of themselves in terms of that label, changed their position on a wide range of other very important foreign policy and other issues. They changed their position on trade. They dropped their protectionism eventually. They changed their position on military spending. They were in favor of it during this earlier period. They were opposed to it during the middle of the 20th century. And then they became in favor of it again. So there isn't some intellectual logic that holds these things together. However, there is a cost to dropping a well-established ideological position. You'll alienate people who previously had supported the party in part for that reason. And you'll have to repudiate positions that perhaps you as a party leader had taken, or at least that your revered predecessors had taken in the past. So it's not something that leaders do lightly, though they can do it. So the fact I've stressed that this constraint is social and political rather than intellectual, this matters because if the constraint arises from the logic of the position, then even if you change the party's position about it, eventually that logic is going to pull you back to the old position. And in fact, I do think in reality, parties can make more or less permanent changes. This is kind of good news in a strange way, because I would sort of like to see them make a permanent change in this position. So anyway, that's one part of the explanation. The other part has to do with avoiding debates on multilateralism during the Cold War period. So for most of the Cold War, conservative Republicans held a pretty marginal position in American politics. Not only was the Democratic Party the dominant one for most of the Cold War period, this is really true up until, say, 1994 or so. Democrats usually control Congress. But even within the Republican Party, there was a split between internationalists who support multilateral rules and more conservative Republicans who oppose these rules. So together with the Democrats, internationalist Republicans were able to marginalize conservative views on this issue. In order to protect the multilateral arrangements that the United States had entered into after 1945, these internationalists really avoided debate on the topic, because if you have a debate, there's a chance you'll lose the debate. So better to just do things without having a serious discussion of this in Congress. So remember all those anti-UN bills that I mentioned? There were 292 of them. It turns out that only 10 of those 292 ever even got so far as a debate on the floor of Congress, and only one of the 292 bills ever became law. That's a rate of getting floor debate and becoming law that's about 10 times lower than it is for other bills on international affairs. And it's because of this agenda setting effort by people who don't want this to become an issue. Party leaders also avoided debate on the ratification of multilateral treaties. The US has actually only ratified 17 of the 46 UN-sponsored human rights treaties that it has signed. And there are a large number of others that the United States has simply refused to sign. And the reason for this is that it requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate to ratify one of these treaties. And it's better to just let the treaty sit out there undiscussed than to bring it up for debate and have it be voted down. And that's what they're trying to avoid. Now, this strategy rests on a really privileged position for the United States in the world. So the US is able to shape these human rights covenants and other multilateral agreements, even though in the end it refuses to ratify them or even to sign them in some cases. You can think of how the US has treated the International Criminal Court recently. It's another example of this. So the United States did initially sign the Rome Statute, but then later the Bush administration revoked the signature and not only refused to ratify it, but is engaged in a whole series of attacks on this institution. And yet at the same time, during the Obama administration, they sort of subtly cooperated with the International Criminal Court. Well, that's the sort of thing that's going on here. This matters because avoiding debate on this perversely shields conservative Republicans from the very real policy consequences of trying to undermine these institutions. In essence, because these things are never going to be seriously debated, and because conservative Republicans for a long time were treated like harmless cranks, they were able to articulate these old positions over and over again without having to worry that the US would actually be pulled out of the United Nations or that other multilateral institutions would actually be destroyed. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, there's a big upsurge in conservative activity, really in the 1990s and beyond, that comes from the fact that they eventually assumed control of the Republican Party. That party split between internationalists and sort of Republican hardline conservative nationalists goes away in the middle of the 1990s. The party becomes monolithically conservative. This is partly because more internationally oriented Republicans are replaced by more conservative Republicans or by Democrats, depending on what sort of district they're in. But the party becomes much more monolithically conservative. This also explains why you get presidents like George W. Bush and Donald Trump. It's because it's a very conservative party that's doing the selecting. It would be nice to believe that if Donald Trump loses in 2020, that this will change and perhaps the Republican Party will revert back to how it was before, but that's simply not going to happen. These are two guys who are frequently mentioned as possible Republican presidential candidates should Donald Trump lose, and they would be up for presidency in 2024. Tom Cotton really came to prominence as a critic of the multilateral Iran nuclear deal. Of course, he since made a name by calling for the use of military force against Americans in the United States. The other guy, Josh Hawley, he's actually the youngest member of the Senate. He's only 40 years old. And he's currently trying to make a name for himself by advocating US withdrawal from the World Trade Organization. So let me offer one concluding thought, and then I'll turn to your questions. I think the future participation of the United States in any rules-based order, whether it's an old one that we revive or a new one that we develop, depends on the Republican right changing its position on this particular issue. Now, the Republican Party is not going away. Even if it loses badly in this fall's election, sooner or later, they're going to return to power. They're the only other major party in the United States. It's unlikely that the US will be able to participate in multilateral rules, multilateral institutions in the way it has in the past, because I don't think other states are going to accord the US this privileged role that it played for much of the Cold War era. The world simply doesn't look like that anymore. And at the same time, new American commitments are not going to be credible as long as everyone knows that any commitment the United States makes to international rules could simply be repudiated when one of these guys takes office in the next presidential election. So it's important that the party change its position on this issue. Unfortunately, it's also not especially likely that they will, for reasons we can talk about later if you're interested. So I thank you for your attention. Let me stop the sharing here so you can see me, and I'll turn to your questions now.
So maybe until we collect the questions from the audience, I just want to give you a short reminder that if you want to ask a question, you can either send me an email on faltermeier@amerikahaus.de, that's FALTERMEIER @amerikahaus.de, or you can just put it down in the YouTube chat and my colleagues will forward the questions to me. While we're collecting questions, let me ask you a question, if I may. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. And I'm wondering, especially, you mentioned that the position in the Cold War did change a little bit within the Republican Party and that there were more internationalist Republicans who also basically defined the way that, for example, people in Germany would think about foreign policy as it was practiced by the US, meaning that they are proud of the transatlantic partnership, that they are investing in NATO, that they are trying to shape the world, the Western world in particular, through multilateral relationships to a certain degree. Now, what I'm trying to ask is, especially if you think about what Trump has said in a couple of days ago, so that he's going to remove, for example, troops from Germany. Would you say that this position on what NATO means to the US is something that has evolved from that earlier position, from that earlier very conservative position, or is that actually a new thing that my opinion is he probably does it mostly because it is popular among his electorate, which is to a certain degree a legitimate reason to do these things. And, but I'm interested in how you would evaluate that kind of position.
Well, the position specifically on NATO, I do think there are opposition to NATO and opposition to multilateral institutions like that is something that is deeply rooted in the Republican Party for the reasons that I argued, going all the way back quite a ways in history. I do think NATO's been a bit of an exception over time for a couple of reasons. One is that during the Cold War, NATO was playing this central role in the US confrontation with the Soviet Union. And that was something that even conservative Republicans support. Their sort of anti-communism overcame their opposition to multilateralism. Even then, though, the skeptics of NATO, such as they were, and there were fewer of them, were almost always conservative Republicans. So if you look at who voted against the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949, it was conservative Republicans who did that. They're the NATO skeptics. I think when the Cold War ended, NATO became a lot less important. It was no longer tied directly to this anti-communist struggle that was so important to conservative Republicans. And so there was more skepticism of NATO as an institution. Well, that's one reason that they tended to be supportive of NATO. The US also played a more predominant role in NATO as an organization than it did in some other multilateral organizations like the World Trade Organization or the United Nations, certainly. So that also was something that sort of tempered Republican opposition to it. So if there's a multilateral organization they're likely to support, it's NATO. But at this point, they tend to be very skeptical of that as well. And Trump's doing a bit of pandering to his own electorate, but at the same time, there are plenty of Republican policy elites who are also pretty skeptical of NATO among real serious conservatives.
Here's my audio. One question that we have here, just let me open that. So this question is, America first is a phrase championed by many Republicans today, but without American support for its allies, especially the EU, Americans would likely no longer benefit from the powerful position they are in today. Can you explain the logic behind this opinion among Trump supporters?
Well, let me start by saying that I completely agree with your premise that the U.S. wouldn't occupy the position it has in the world today without the support of its allies. That's always been very important. I think that conservative Republicans going all the way back to the early 20th century have taken a really skeptical view of that. And it's partly because the policy priorities that the U.S. alliance with the European states have not been ones Republicans have accorded an especially high priority to. So during the Cold War, they tended to focus more on anti-communism in Asia and in Latin America, less developed parts of the world. That was another element of their pre-1914 foreign policy that they retained afterwards. Democrats, even before World War II, were always more interested in Europe than Republicans were as a place to trade with and as a potential source of allies and things like that. And that's partly because of the economic relationships that the South, which was the sort of geographic center of the Democratic Party, had with Europe before then. The South was a raw material exporting area, so they had these special relations with the Europeans. So I think it's easier to become a skeptic of NATO and of US developed allies in general if you're from a political milieu where other parts of the world are seen as more important and where you've always been suspicious of European intentions. Because, as I said, that foreign policy before World War I was deeply suspicious of European intentions. They viewed them as likely enemies, and that was the purpose of building up the Navy the way they did.
Okay, thank you. Then we have another question, which says, Trump is cutting funds to the WHO on the position that the institution is biased and controlled by China. Other than NATO or the UN, is this criticism of WHO and similar institutions echoed within the Republican Party, or is it just Trump who is pushing these policies? Thank you for the question.
Yes, thanks for the question. This is a position that is applied to nearly every multilateral organization. Republicans are skeptical of them. They're especially skeptical of organizations whose purposes they don't think are important. At least they don't think the US should be spending money on. So big public health enterprises are something they're especially likely to be skeptical of. However, it's worth noting that even multilateral organizations that advance goals that Republicans or conservative Republicans tend to support are often also the target of skepticism. So for instance, in 1994, when the last of the sort of general agreement on tariff and trade treaties was signed, establishing the WTO, Republicans and conservative Republicans tended to be more in favor of international trade. The skeptics of trade during that period in the United States tended to be on the left. However, conservative Republicans were skeptical of the WTO because it was an international organization, even though it was dedicated to promoting goals that they supported. And if you look at the debate on the WTO in 1994, the reasons they gave for this was that the US might be outvoted by other states, or that Japan at the time, the sort of major trade rival of the United States, would somehow gain control over the WTO. They're just deeply suspicious of any organization that has the ability to constrain the United States. Interestingly, at the same time, the North American Free Trade Agreement was also being debated in Congress. But the North American Free Trade Agreement was strictly between the US, Canada, and Mexico. It was basically two bilateral trade agreements. And there was no such skepticism of that agreement. And it was much more likely to be supported by conservative Republicans than by anybody else. Okay, thank you.
Let me just add to that, because since you talked about free trade, a couple of years ago, I think the Obama administration pushed like two big free trade treatises. One was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the other one was the TTIP, as we say in Germany, which was basically the free trade agreement supposed to be a free trade agreement between the EU and the United States. And especially the TTIP agreement was seen in Germany very skeptical by people more on the political left. So the Green Party was skeptical whether if we're buying, I don't know, food from the United States, that would mean that we have to lower our standards or so, or we have to put higher standards on other things as well. So there was a lot of skepticism, but the public debate was very much controlled, or the criticism was very much controlled by more leftist-leaning parties, I would say. And I also always had the opinion that free trade is something that, especially like the neoliberal wing within the Republican Party, which I think definitely existed, would embrace. So I was really kind of surprised when, especially TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was basically dead at day one of the Trump administration. And TTIP, I'm not sure if it's buried yet, but I don't think that they can revive it again. So what I'm interested in is whether, I mean, especially TPP, that was an agreement by the US, a very powerful economic nation, and a lot of tiny countries, basically. So theoretically, you could argue that the hierarchy that was the leverage that the United States had was kind of similar to the leverage that they had during protectionism in the early 20th century. So I'm interested why the Republican Party would let go of that agreement so easily, and whether this is in some way connected to the skepticism of multilateral institutions as such.
Mm-hmm. It may be somewhat connected to opposition to multilateral institutions, although I think that the biggest reason that for skepticism about the TPP is that Trump is a protectionist. Now, as a protectionist, I think Trump is kind of unusual in recent Republican Party elites. There was discussion of trade issues during the Republican presidential debates before the primary, when Trump was debating other Republicans. And he was really alone on the stage, being a protectionist. Protectionism is not a position that Republicans have taken much recently, though historically in the party, it was a protectionist party, but that hasn't been true for 70 plus years. So this, I think it's his protectionism that's really at the root of his opposition to TTP. Now, because of protectionism isn't as deeply rooted historically in the Republican Party as their opposition to multilateralism, which has been consistent over time, I think that's something that could shift back under another Republican president. Though I will say that Trump has been quite effective at tamping down opposition to his protectionism within the Republican Party. And the two guys I showed you, Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, are just as protectionist as Trump is. He sort of revived that. I do question how salient that policy commitment is. Like they might go back to being in favor of free trade under the right circumstances. And I should also say that there are plenty of trade skeptics among Democrats as well. It's not as though the Democrats have become a free trade party or something like that. They really aren't. Both parties are split on this issue, I think, right now.
Let me see. Do you think that so there's another question from the audience. Do you think that the Democratic Party will embrace multilateral institutions again and be more polite towards their partners?
I do think that. The Democrats all along have consistently supported multilateral institutions in the same way that Republicans were split on it, but Democrats were pretty much always in favor of it. That's certainly been true. Democrats have been extremely critical of the Trump administration's attacks on multilateral institutions, the ones about climate change, its treatment of the World Health Organization, all of that stuff. So there's every indication that Democrats will go back to that. As I said, the big danger from my point of view is that because other states who participate in these organizations and accept these multilateral rules know that the United States might turn against them again if another Republican comes into office, that US commitments to these things just won't be believable. That's going to make it very hard for the United States, even for Democrats who are genuinely in favor of these institutions, to persuade other states to go along with these multilateral agreements. So if, let's say, a hypothetical Biden administration decided that it wanted to revive the multilateral Iran nuclear deal, it would have to persuade not only its European partners and also Russia and China, but also the Iranians that we really are going to adhere to this agreement now. And they're going to have to do that with those other states knowing that, as sincere as Joe Biden and his administration might be about this, that when Josh Hawley somehow is elected president in 2024, that whole agreement is going right back out the window again.
Okay, thank you. Okay, the next question from the audience is, how big of an impact would you say will foreign policy and its implications have on the election campaigns of both Trump and most likely Biden?
Well, typically in the United States, foreign policy hasn't been that important of an issue in most elections. The exceptions to that typically are times when the United States is actually at war. So the Iraq War certainly had an effect on, say, the 2006 and 2008 elections. Interestingly, though, George Bush was reelected in 2004 in spite of the fact that the war was going on and the war was unpopular. So it probably won't play that important of a role. However, Trump's positions on foreign policy have been sufficiently extreme that it might play somewhat of a role for some people. You know, in the end, though, if you look at the upcoming US presidential election right now, partisanship, just as a feature apart from people's issue opinions, partisanship is so strong in the United States and so pervasive that it's hard to believe that much of any issue will make any difference. I mean, you can observe in the United States a series of scandals and terrible issue positions being taken, and none of it appears to have much of an impact on public opinion. We've just about seen the strongest trend against President Trump over the last 3 months in public opinion. His approval ratings have dropped. But if you look at the size of that drop, it's not very large. It's only 4 or 5 points. In each direction. It totals up to maybe a 15-point gap. And the reason for that is that partisanship so completely determines people's attitudes on things that none of those events matter, or the issues don't matter, nothing much matters except your party position.
Thank you. One more question tackles the issue whether, I mean, you said, it's a long question, I'm gonna summarize that. So, you basically said that opposition to multilateralism has been lingering within the Republican Party, basically during the Cold War, and it was always there, but it wasn't very present, at least for the larger audience, because the leadership basically tried to let it become very present to the public. So the question is whether other issues, for example, the position on race or the relationship to the Confederacy, so topics that are coming up right now, have they the same trajectory, or would you say that basically the Republican Party has evolved on this issue in a couple of ways?
Actually, the issue of race is one on which the Republican Party really has changed over time, as has the Democratic Party. In the early 20th century, the period I was talking about for foreign policy, it was quite clear that the Democratic Party was the party of the Jim Crow South. So Southern Democrats were the ones who constructed this sort of system of racial apartheid that prevailed in their states on up until at least the 1960s. That began to change over time. There's some debate among political scientists about exactly when that change occurred. The best evidence is that the change started in the late 1930s, that the New Deal coalition within the Democratic Party included politicians who really tried to appeal to Black voters who had moved to northern cities. And that's sort of the germ of the Democratic Party changing its position on race. The Republican Party had been the more liberal party on race up until the early 1960s. Beginning in the 1960s, though, Republicans, once the Democratic Party at the sort of national level, the presidents Johnson and Kennedy, once they began to embrace racial equality and the Civil Rights Act and things like that, that there was an opportunity for Republicans to move into the South, a region in which they hadn't been able to have any elected officials for a long time. So they began changing their position on race in the 1960s in an effort to appeal to the South. But it took a really long time for the South to change from being a predominantly Democratic region, which it had been since the Civil War, to a predominantly Republican region. This process started in the 1960s, but it wasn't really complete until the middle of the 1990s. So it's really the 1994 election. There are lots of Southern Democrats who lose and are replaced by Southern Republicans. So the reason that the Republican Party became the one that sort of celebrates the memory of the Confederacy as they do and take some of the positions on racial issues in the United States that they take, that is a more recent vintage than the stuff I've been talking about here. But it is definitely something that's changed historically over time.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have time for at least 2 more questions. So how do you think the current pandemic, with its damaging effects on the world economy, will change transatlantic relations?
That's a tough one. I'll tell you what I would like to believe. I think that the pandemic underscores just how interdependent the world is and the need for transatlantic cooperation and for multilateral cooperation really more globally than that. I would think that would sort of bring this to people's attention, and maybe plans could be hatched to deal better with the next pandemic than we dealt with this one. But of course, all these things are subject to politics. Just because something seems right to me sure doesn't mean that it's going to happen in actual political life. So it could be that another way of spinning this would be for people may blame or attempt to blame foreign countries for the spread of the pandemic in the United States. I mean, the Trump administration has clearly been trying to do this with respect to China. So they want to, he wants to name the virus after China, and he's even willing to do this in ways that are, like, frankly, pretty openly racist. But if you engage in scapegoating of other states, blaming them for the political and economic problems that arise because of the pandemic, then it could make multilateral cooperation harder. I really hope it goes in the first direction that I mentioned, but I don't feel confident predicting that it will.
Okay, so I think the last question will be, how does the position that the Republican Party took in the last couple of years towards multilateral institutions relate to its electorate? Do they really think about that a lot, or is it more an emotional issue?
I think for the most part, the position that the party has taken on multilateralism is something that exists primarily at the elite level. So it's articulated and re-articulated by politicians and party activists and sort of professional ideologists and others like that. It's a pretty esoteric issue, and I don't think it's one on which the public typically has strong opinions. You need to be pretty engaged in politics before you start to have strong views about multilateralism or not, or frankly, before you even start to know what multilateralism even is. So I don't think it's very strongly rooted in that. Now, there are things that you can do with opposition to multilateralism that do have a sort of ideological appeal to the public. So if you scapegoat multilateral institutions in ways that appeal to people's xenophobic views or their racist views, that's something that you can make that be widespread. But really what you're doing there is you're not so much using opposition to multilateralism, you're using the racism and xenophobia as a way to push people in an anti-multilateral direction. So I tend to think that most of what I've talked about today is happening at the level of politicians and party activists. I will say, though, it's not something that I've looked at directly. What I'd really like to do is get a hold of some public opinion polls over a long period of time and then see if there really are party differences over multilateralism between Democrats and Republicans, and particularly between conservative Republicans and everybody else, if those have persisted over time. I suspect that if I did that, there would be some difference, but it wouldn't be especially large because there'll be a large number of people who think of themselves as conservative Republicans for reasons other than opposition to multilateralism, and they don't much care about that.
Okay, so let me see. I think we've done a good job. Thank you very much, Ben. It was a pleasure having you here. It was a really, really interesting talk. And I think it's also very important right now in this period of tension between the US, the EU, the US and China. The world is undergoing a lot of complicated and complex evolutions and revolutions to a certain degree. And I think there's still hope, as you mentioned, because things might change again. So multilateralism might become a little bit more popular, maybe if there will be a new administration, maybe even under Trump. You never know. Trump is always good for a surprise, I guess. So we'll see what's going to happen, especially, I mean, from the German perspective, we are always trying, especially the amerikahaus is always trying to promote transatlantic relations and to talk about the importance of this partnership. And I think this talk actually helped a lot. Thank you for explaining us how the current position came about. And thank you for your time. And thank you in the audience for your time.